Hello and welcome to Postgres FM, a weekly show about all things PostgreSQL. I am Michael, founder of PG Mustard, and this is my co-host Nikolai, founder of Postgres AI. Hey Nikolai, what are we talking about today?
Hi Michael, it was a great pleasure to meet you in person a couple of days ago. Finally.
Yeah, finally.
In Berlin, Germany.
But we didn't take a photograph, so we can't prove it happened.
I also already realized it was a mistake, definitely. So we will talk. Let's have some almost non-technical talk about discussion about how to contribute to Postgres, what obstacles you can meet, how to pass those obstacles, fix them, and so on, and what contribution, what kinds of contribution we can do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had requests about talking, I think probably reading them, I assume they were talking about code-wise, maybe specifically, or at least everything that's included, so maybe documentation. But it would be great to also discuss contributing in other ways, community ways, other ways that help the project in general.
Right. There are several good talks from people who first of all, we don't contribute quite actively, right? Like I'm kind of very minor contributor. I had this coin with Postgres 14, and I already had notification that I am included to Postgres contributor list this year. I'm in Postgres 15, so maybe we'll have another coin. I also was contributing more, a little bit more, 15 years ago or so in Postgres 8.3, working on XML data type and functions, but I'm definitely not a C programmer at all. So that's it for me.
You say that's it, and I think hopefully a lot of our listeners would completely disagree with you in terms of contributing to Postgres evangelism and talking about Postgres, educating about Postgres. You do loads. The Postgres TV channel has been a great resource for me, especially over the years. I've learned a lot of things through there. I've seen some great talks that I wouldn't have got a chance to see otherwise. Equally, you open source a lot of other code in and around the Postgres ecosystem. There's a lot of contributions there. So I think it depends a little bit on definitions. But if we're talking only to Postgres core code base, I guess I've contributed 0 to Postgres. But if we talk about the wider ecosystem, I feel like I've contributed a fair amount in terms of, I've translated a migration guide, I've written a little browser extension, I've done some documentation for, like external documentation for Explain, things like that. And these, of course. So it feels to me like we're contributing, maybe giving talks at conferences, that kind of thing. But if you only count code base wise, yeah, there's definitely, and there's always people that contribute more.
Yeah, so our classification of contribution could include at least one dimension where we see like code and non-code contributions, right? We can distinguish them. Sometimes they come together, and also another dimension is this very old concept that open source is more like bazaar compared to enterprise software, which is more like cathedral. I think in our Postgres bazaar, in the center of it, we have huge cathedral, which is controlled by quite centralized way. And this is Postgres code base. And if you want to contribute to that code base, you need to follow some rules and approaches and so on, and be ready to apply quite a good amount of energy to be included and considered as a contributor in that cathedral. So I started from describing this cathedral, but around it we have a lot of other buildings and sometimes not buildings, like many things. It's really bazaar. First of all, a lot of additional software, pieces of software, for example, extensions, some tools, many of them open source, most of them open source, some are not. And you can also consider, some are purely open source, and many of them have a Postgres license, which is very open, very short and very open BSD style license. You can do whatever you want. Just don't erase author names. That's it, basically, right? So you can even sell it and don't share. You can not share your changes. But some software, of course, related to Postgres has different license, but you still can contribute. For example, Timescale has dual license, and you can contribute to purely open source part and so on. Or for example, GitLab. Yeah, so GitLab or also Database Lab. I wanted to mention our product as well. We have a GPL v3 license, so it's not BSD at all, but still you can contribute there as well.
And,
huge ecosystem.
Full transparency, PG Mustard is completely closed source.
Yeah, we have discussion with what is better, right?
Yeah. But yeah, so let's do those two things then. I think it'd be, because of the requests and because of what people seem to want to know most, I think we should start with how, I think you'd be great to introduce how to contribute from a code perspective, how to get started there, and then we can talk a bit more about contributions more generally, or ways of getting started maybe elsewhere.
Right. So let's distinguish big cathedral in the center of our bazaar and all other places of our bazaar. All other places, it's easy. You go to this project if you like the project. Usually they have in README some like contribution section, or contributing.md, for example. It's kind of standard right now for open source projects. Yeah. Our Database Lab engine also has contributing.md, explaining where to start, where to find good first tasks, to check code style and so on. But if we talk about the main cathedral, I wanted to mention several good materials. We can recommend them in show notes. Unfortunately, material I quickly remembered, it was from Anastasia Lubennikova. It was in Russian, sorry, so I cannot recommend those who don't speak Russian. But there was a blog post in Timescale blog last year from I forgot the name, sorry, also Russian-speaking engineer from Timescale. But it was quite good intro post. You can check that, and you can provide a couple of recommendations and check our show notes, right?
Yeah, there was a talk by Leticia, I believe, recently. I can't remember if it was recorded. I'll get the link to that if it was. Or maybe she's very good at publishing her slides, so maybe at least those. And there was one that it was with examples, I think, one from Melanie Plagerman. I'm sorry, I've probably pronounced both of those badly, but those talks were fantastic. And it definitely seems like there's quite a high barrier to entry, but those talks make it, give you a nice process for how to go about doing so.
Right, but if so far we talk about only the code contributions. Very roughly, the process is this. First, you need to learn how to compile source code on your system. It's super easy, especially on Linux. There is a wiki web page which describes what you need to install on your system. I usually do it on Linux remotely in Tmax. I have Postgres checked out. Postgres usually, like, you will have master branch. You can check it out from GitHub or GitLab, github.com/Postgres or gitlab.com/Postgres. It's a mirror, right? And it has Postgres doesn't use branches for development. I mean, for no regular Git flow, like development feature branches. Branches are only to maintain major versions. Right, so like stable release number 15, uppercase, you will see it. So you can check the code out and switch to the branch you want to explore. For example, we check out, and either we stay in the current development line as Postgres 16, or we can switch to previous one, 15, and if you want to develop our addition into 15 branch, right? So we switch. And then we need to just compile it. It's just 3 lines. You need to install dependencies, as I've said, like also several packages. But then it's first configure with prefix. I usually do like prefix in my home dir because just avoid dealing with permissions and sudo at all, because this Postgres will be like temporary for development purposes, so I don't install it into some like outside of my home directory. Everything is inside. So you mentioned prefix, and that's it. /configure -- prefix equals some path. You wait a little bit. If you install all dependencies correctly, it won't complain. So, and then you just make its compilation. It will require some time, CPU time, but usually it finishes successfully. And then make install, and you have Postgres installed in the directory you used in prefix. That's it. Only 3 lines. Simple, easy, super easy.
Yeah, and for anybody, if that sounds intimidating, then kind of baby steps before then can be anytime you're curious about a feature, how something works in Postgres, you can start by looking at the code. Searching on the GitHub Mirror, for example, looking at the code comments, things like that, starting to get familiar with things. And also, the impression I got is there's some parts of the code base, well, I guess it's obvious, but there's some parts of the code base that don't touch as much of the rest of it. So there's no list of open issues or anything. So maybe you need to start starting to monitor some of the mailing lists to start to see what questions are coming up, that kind of thing.
Right.
Is that sensible or no?
Development is done in PG Skill Hackers at postgresql.org mailing list. So you need to subscribe. You can see archives on website, and also there is CommitFest kind of software supporting to group discussions and the patches. Have on a single page for it's like replacement for pull request, I would say, kind of. So, like, if we have some feature, the development can last years, actually. And CommitFest entry is where people manually register, okay, we have this feature, and track status, lifecycle. So, is it under review or returned with comments to the author? So, some changes are requested and so on. But everything is done through mailing list, and you need to attach a patch to your email.
So it's like a project management system, isn't it? Like it's the CommitFest are almost like a way of project managing a little bit. Yes. But I would add that often comes up as a really good recommendation for a place to start in reviewing other people's patches. So sometimes it's
exactly
lower barrier to entry.
So once you know how to compile and make Postgres working. I mean, if you run an initdb initialized database and you connect to Postgres, like on special port, for example, you adjust the port. If you have other Postgres running, usually, like if we can run multiple Postgres, we just need to use different ports. So once you are able to compile from sources and make Postgres running, you can check some patch. This is a great idea. You go to CommitFest list of currently patches. There are always many things that need review. So you can check something. Then you need to learn how to apply patch to your source code. Interesting thing that once you compile everything, if you change something, you can just say make, and it will compile only what was changed, so it will be much faster. That's how you can iterate. And same thing as with minor upgrades, you just need to replace a binary and restart Postgres, and you have already new version of it. So iteration is quite simple and fast. You changed code, make install, restart Postgres, and you're already working with new binary. So you applied patch, make install, restart Postgres, and you're already working with patched Postgres. The only thing usually, like, you need like something like -p1 or something to ignore some leading parts of the path. So you need to know how to use patch command line in Linux.
Did you mention the wiki already?
Yeah, wiki has required libraries you need to install before you try to compile. Yeah, I mentioned briefly, but it's like couple of lines of packages, apt-get install, blah, blah, blah. And this is needed before you start, definitely, yes.
I've thought of something people need to be familiar with C, I guess, or get familiar with C to contribute to the.
I
core
disagree
Postgres.
with you. I disagree.
Oh,
First,
okay.
yes, I disagree. C is you familiar with C. I don't consider myself familiar with C. Like I learned it at university. I used it many times, but I forgot everything. Everything. Well, there is Java, JavaScript, other languages which are similar, kind of, right? You can lack a lot of knowledge, but you still can try to compile and use Postgres, right? This is super big contribution to review patch, not from the perspective of code, but from perspective of feature, from behavior, right? So this is one thing. Second thing, to read source code, you don't need to know C. Open GitHub or GitLab Mirror. Just read all comments. Comments explain a lot, and also sometimes readme.md in the same directory. Or txt, I don't remember. So readme file, which explains what's happening inside some directory. And this is enough to start, right? So you don't, it's not a requirement to make source contributions to know C. But of course, if you need to write a substantial part of code, you need to be familiar with C. But not for reviewing patches.
This is a very good point. Mm-hmm. The reason I brought it up as well is that, go on.
Yeah, I wish actually reviewing patches would be even easier. I know there is CI/CD already used from, I forgot the company. It's not GitHub, not GitLab. Some other company provides infrastructure to run tests and so on. If we had, maybe we have it. Maybe I'm missing some details here. But imagine if we already have binaries for various platforms for each feature branch. So reviewing user-wise, from user perspective, would be much easier. You just install that branch, like a revision. This is this commit you're reviewing, or this patch you're reviewing. But unfortunately, like there is a barrier. But I must assure you, knowing C is not a requirement for reviewing patches.
Yeah, fair. And one other, like very, very close to Postgres.
Sorry for interruption. To complete picture, knowing C is not requirement. Requirement is knowing how Postgres works and to be a Postgres user. So if you are a DBA or programmer, developer who uses PostgreSQL, you know how it works in terms of SQL, some details, and you know if this patch adjusts some behavior, this is what needed. You can say, before it worked this way, now it worked this way, I checked these corner or edge cases, and you can provide very useful, helpful feedback to mailing list.
Exactly. Replying on the mailing list is as easy as replying to an email. That's the barrier to entry there. And I've been able to do that even with a couple of different patches. That one of them was planning this. It's still not committed, but it's planning to add extra information to joins or nested loop operations when
to explain output. Do you mean?
Yes, exactly. And as a tool provider, I'm able to add context as to when those, for example, they're planning to add a minimum and a max rows per loop, which is really useful when, for example, the average rows per loop is 0, or it's below 0.5. It's really helpful to know that any rows are returned, because if you only get returned the average, as a tool, you need to kind of display 0 or make an estimate, which is really not optimal and misleading at times. So having that max is really helpful at times, and a total especially. So I think that's giving extra context that you have as a user or as someone else in the ecosystem can be really helpful if all people are thinking about is the code. There was another area that I was interested in talking about, which is kind of projects around the core, which seem quite central, like, for example, the software that runs the mailing lists and displays the mailing lists. I believe that's a Django project, for example. So there are other projects written in different languages, very, very close to the core experience of Postgres that use different technologies as well.
Right. And before we switch to move further, of course, if you know C and you can analyze the patch from a code perspective and or write some patch, of course, then you need to know some details how, like, to know about Postgres macros, a lot of macros inside the code, some like try begin, a lot of stuff, and also how to use GDB debugger, how to deal with some core dumps when it crashes and so on. But it's already like moving further, right? I think it's not already. It will be obvious. Wiki has a lot of information, of course. So it's easy to find some interesting like details. But what, like, if you want to discuss mailing list, yes, for me it's a huge barrier. Like sometimes I have some proposal and I post a patch for code or documentation. By the way, documentation lives in the same repository in doc or docs directory, and it's in SGML format, which like is a superset of HTML, XML, XHTML, and XML. So it's then converted to HTML. A kind of interesting markup language I would like to avoid. But anyway, it's there. It's not difficult to adjust it. And then you can you can have a diff and send patch in mailing list. But it's painful. Like I would like for example, documentation on our website, I can edit it right on my phone or iPad easily. Like I don't need to compile anything and so on. Like I don't need to extract code. I can do it on GitLab or GitHub, and just that's it. And I even using CI/CD, I will automatically have result, right, and check how it looks.
In fact, I have a recommendation for you for open talks. There, an absolutely fantastic talk at the Postgres EU conference just now by somebody not from the Postgres ecosystem, and she's a professional technical writer and actually documentation architect, and really went into detail about how much Postgres gets a lot of compliments for how good its documentation is, but there are also a lot of ways it can be a lot better, and one of them was how much we could lower the barrier to people being able to contribute to it.
The process of changing documentation, it's the same as the source code. So you don't need to compile maybe, but unless you need to know how to convert from HTML to HTML. But again, like you need check out source code, deal with these files only on computer, roughly. Yeah, you can connect to server, run Tmux right on phone, but it will be really painful. So yes, this is the process, and it's not like each time I have some proposal, it hurts, like easily, like. But I consider this workflow as very old-fashioned and outdated, and it's because of these barriers. I'm 100% sure many people don't contribute. So if you want to contribute, you need to be prepared to apply more energy than you can expect initially.
I think unlike a lot of open source projects, the default is not it. Mailing lists you don't have to have a resolution. For example, in GitHub workflow, if you open an issue, it eventually has to eventually be closed. Otherwise, it continues. Or
pull request, merge request, right?
Exactly, but that would still close the issue, right? Whereas a mailing list, a thread...
There are statuses. Yeah.
Yes, but my point really is that in my experience, for example, with the documentation, one of my minor contributions was trying to push forward the change for defaulting to the current... So trying to get search engines to pick up that telling search engines...
Problem solved, this is good.
Yes, it's
almost
a big
daily
achievement.
Like it actually. So I notice it almost daily, and it's so good that it's finally solved.
So Nikolai and I know what we're talking about here, but for everybody else, it's the problem with when you Google search for something that you hope the Postgres documentation will cover.
Alter table Postgres, and you see some very
exactly.
old.
in the past, maybe if you searched that 6 months ago, you might have, it was a real lottery as to which version of Postgres documentation you would get linked to.
In most cases, it was not the latest version.
Yeah, exactly. Almost always it was not the latest. And now, through probably about a history of maybe 10, 12, 15 different threads that were started on the mailing list, it eventually gathered enough consensus. And I think
I raised this a couple of times. A couple of those threads are mine, yes. But
I think the final thread that did work actually might have started with you. So, well, actually, no, I think it was Andres from Microsoft, Andres Freund. So,
but it was very good analysis of previous threads, like this is whole picture, right? I remember.
And that, for me, was a really good example of sometimes the patience that's needed, but also the process. The process by default ends in nothing happening.
You need to push constantly. Push,
exactly.
Push.
So that don't give up, and also build consensus. So starting with a patch isn't always the best advice. Maybe it is the best way of getting feedback on the specifics, but you can also start with a discussion, start with a suggestion, and start to try and build consensus. See if people even agree with your approach before you start coding. That seems to be how some people do it and get success. So
talk about design and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Trade-offs, alternatives that you considered, examples of the problem that you've seen, that kind of thing.
Right. And speaking of mailing list, another problem, quite huge one. We all already got used to use diff discussion per line, like in pull request, merge request, we can say in this line we see this, we can start discussing it. And we have single context for everyone, and multiple discussions can happen at the same time. When you talk about the code and you discuss some patch in mailing list, you refer to some line, and then if another person's already sent a new version of patch, you're already starting to visualize this. So you need quite good imagination of code in your head to speak about multiple versions. It even hurt me when I worked on translation of release notes, because some bug was in the original text in English, and it was fixed, and the line changed, and then my patch patch may be adjusted, but previous discussions referring to some lines. So it's difficult, believe me.
Yeah. Translations is, in fact, maybe that's a good time. I know we don't have loads of time left, but it'd be good to cover at least a few other ways that people can contribute to the wider project. And translations is a really good starting point for that, I think. If you speak another language other than English and you're keen to help, there's a lot of efforts to translate different things, and it's often, if you look at the list of people that have done each language, it's a very small list of people doing a lot of work there. So I'm grateful to everybody who has been involved in those projects.
Those people who translate release notes, they have understanding of what's new. Actually, I was translated to Russian for many years until this year, and I actually enjoyed it. Like I know many details. I spent some time for translating. I know some details, but maybe you can just blog post about new features and about some things and so on and so on. It's also, like, of course, we are coming outside of main cathedral in the center, so you can write content, you can create videos. I think it's obvious Postgres needs more when you search good materials. Of course, sometimes every problem you dive in, you will find maybe something, but usually it's not enough, and you can discuss your experience and help content-based grow as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in this area, I want to say, like, also, Planet PostgreSQL.org is the good place to start seeing what Postgres ecosystem has, but keep in mind that it focuses mostly on texts. For example, if you if you push something, try to push video only or some infographics, something not non-textual, they probably will not approve this posting, and you won't be able to be present on Planet. But I think like we do podcast, YouTube channel,
Yep.
some infographics. Like not everyone can read long texts. I personally have issues with reading long text. I can write one, but reading one is always even more difficult for me than writing. It's just I'm very visual person, and I see in very different areas, technical areas, how sometimes good visualization can be. And I'm sure Postgres can have more materials. Postgres ecosystem can have more materials. Even sometimes dealing with code. I remember we created several things, like you take code and you start visualizing this line is responsible for this behavior, and it helps you understand how particular thing is working. So infographics, good also idea, right?
Yeah, I've seen some good ones. They get distributed on Twitter, for example. So it can be as easy as that, putting something together and sharing it, and maybe tag some people that you know would share it and let us know. On that note, things like Postgres Weekly is quite good at distributing things like that as well. Picking up on things.
They share all types of materials. I agree.
Yeah.
Right. And why we like focusing on this because the documentation is amazing. I like documentation actually. It's great. 3,000 pages if you print it on A4 format. But the problem with documentation is, of course, it lacks many things. For example, pictures, only one or two. How many? Like gene indexes.
5 now.
5 already. Wow, I'm lagging. But only 5, right? So there is opportunity here. And it lacks a lot of how-to style pieces. Sometimes you have something in the end of page, some usage notes, but it lacks completely how-tos. For example, I just want to set up replication and steps. Better with some screenshots or visualization of console or of anything like screencast. It lacks it. There are attempts to build like additional. There are websites that try to deliver similar content, but still it's far from being perfect to this area. How to styles, how to style documents.
Yeah, exactly. But all those additional things you're talking about, they're all examples of people contributing, I think, to the Postgres project. There's lots of examples of those. So I think it's also probably quite important to say, you don't have to ask for permission to put something up as a third party. So for example, that browser, I made a browser extension before that before the problem was solved on Google and other search engines to get to the latest version. I made a browser extension, put it on Firefox, put it on Chrome web stores, made the source available. I didn't have to ask for permission from anybody. It's not widely used, but you don't have to wait. You don't have to go to the cathedral and ask permission to be let in. You can set up your own little stall. You don't even have to pay to have a stall at the bazaar.
Because wide view on it's a huge bazaar, really. So sometimes people prefer not going to Cathedral. For example, Percona, they created pgstat monitor, and it's actually a replacement for pgstat statements, solving some of its problems. And they decided not to work on it as a part, like not improving pgstat statements, just to have their own release cycle, not to be dependent on the core development, and so on and so on. It's an option. Definitely.
Extensions are a huge contribution to the Postgres ecosystem, and even company the team behind the extension Zombo DB that does Elasticsearch to Postgres.
Bridge between Elastic. Mm-hmm.
Amazing project, but I'd say an even bigger contribution they've done to the Postgres ecosystem is the extension framework behind it to help make extensions even easier to write. So that's a fantastic contribution to the ecosystem.
There are thousands of extensions, but also don't forget additional utilities, not extensions, but utilities. That, our database lab engine, it's not an extension; it's additional software, and there are many other pieces of software. And there is a curated list of Postgres projects, extensions, and tools, and so on. Awesome Postgres, it's called Awesome Postgres. We will provide a link. Of course, it doesn't have everything, but has many things. So
has a lot of things that are awesome on it.
It's said that there is no such list of curated materials for content about Postgres.
I think on Awesome Postgres there are some. Maybe we should
Some.
add some more to that. Maybe,
Some. But
yeah,
it should be structured very differently than software. Very differently. Because content
Okay.
is not software. It's another story.
Maybe you need a pull request. You can do your preferred method
Maybe.
on Awesome.
Maybe we will discuss this separately, but there are
Yeah.
several starting points where you can check and find opportunity to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, that's it, I think.
Oh, I have one more actually. Wanted to give a shout out to everybody in the Telegrams, Discord, Slacks. IRC was particularly helpful to me. People that help beginners. That's a big contribution to the ecosystem as well. And especially people that are friendly to beginners.
Stack Overflow as well, right?
Yeah, and you don't have to be that technical. You could, if you're one step ahead of somebody, you can help them along.
The problem with this, always for me, when I start doing this, by the way, it's a good antidepressant or something. Like if you have some issues, some stress, just go and help someone on Stack Overflow, some chats, Telegram, I don't know, like anywhere. And the problem with me, usually, when someone asks something, and you think you know the answer, but then you start researching, and couple of hours later you understand you already learned a lot. It's as good, but you also didn't want to spend so much time for it. So, but it's good, really. Like I know like people who do it constantly, and it's like some hobby, helping others.
Yeah.
It's good, and like it feels good, definitely. But it can be easy all your time, easily.
Yeah, and maybe if you learn and you spot patterns of what people are asking. I know Depez is very good at this. He spots patterns of what people are asking and then writes a blog post about it, so he can just send them the link in future. It's a good way of getting into understanding what do people care most about. What should I do a video about? What should the documentation cover better? So if you want to contribute, or what it may be even what should Postgres behave differently? Should it have a different default? That kind of thing. So maybe getting involved in those communities might even be a really good starting point.
Postgres definitely should have different defaults.
Yeah, different topic.
Right. Okay.
Wonderful.
Good.
Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Sorry, this one's a bit later than usual, and looking forward to getting another one for you next week.
I've got. Did you get it as well? I've got several good personal pieces of personal feedback. Like people told this was incredibly great.
At the conference, it was bizarre. Bizarre being approached, being like, "Are you the people from Postgres?"
Yeah. I enjoyed. So I answered this. This is exactly what drives us. So we thank you for feedback. So please continue providing feedback, like, share. Oh, by the way, special announcement today: if you have Apple device, iPhone or iPad, please go to Apple Podcasts and write review. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Would be much appreciated, and especially thanks to everybody that came up to us and said gave us feedback in person as well. I know it's a bit not possible for everybody, but we appreciated it.
Great, thank you.
Take care.
We did it. We didn't miss another week. Great.
No, nice one.
Take
care.
Next week. Bye.